Right now, Iran is more isolated than it has been since the 1979 revolution, and the numbers from 2025 tell a devastating story. Israel's October 2024 air campaign alone neutralized over two-thirds of Iran's long-range missile launchers, exposing just how vulnerable Tehran had become. Proxy funding has sharply declined due to sanctions and regional strains. Key alliance meetings haven't happened in over 8 months. Even Russia and China, Iran's supposed strategic partners, are keeping their distance. What started as a calculated geopolitical strategy has become a masterclass in how rapidly decades of relationship building can collapse when the foundation proves weaker than anyone imagined. The proxy network that was supposed to last forever. Iran's grand design rested on a network of armed allies that Tehran believed would never abandon their patron. For over 4 decades, Iran built what it considered an unbreakable system of regional influence. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Tehran would fund, arm, and train militant groups across the Middle East, creating a network of allies that could strike at Iran's enemies from multiple directions simultaneously. This wasn't just about having friends in the region. This was Iran's insurance policy against annihilation. The financial commitment was staggering. Iran spent hundreds of millions each year to arm and train proxies from Gaza to Yemen. These weren't charitable donations. Every dollar came with expectations. The military hardware flowing through these channels told the real story of Iran's ambitions. Hamas alone launched over 10,000 rockets during the October 7th attacks, demonstrating the scale of weapons Iran had provided. Hezbollah accumulated an arsenal that rivaled some national armies, with an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. The Houthis gained access to drone technology and anti-ship missiles that could threaten global shipping lanes. Iranian advisors embedded with these groups, providing tactical expertise and ensuring operational coordination. The Revolutionary Guard's Quds force maintained direct communication lines with commanders across the network. Iran's strategic logic was brutally simple. If Tehran faced a direct military threat, particularly from Israel or the United States, the proxy network would activate like a distributed defense system. Hamas would unleash hell from Gaza in the south. Hezbollah would rain missiles down from Lebanon in the north. The Houthis would shut down Red Sea shipping from the west. No enemy could handle simultaneous attacks from multiple directions while also trying to strike Iran directly. Each proxy group served a specific function in this grand design. The entire system was designed to make attacking Iran prohibitively expensive. But this network represented far more than military coordination. Iran treated proxy relationships as the foundation of its entire regional security architecture. These groups provided Iran with plausible deniability for attacks against its enemies while extending Tehran's strategic reach far beyond its borders. They offered early warning systems, intelligence gathering capabilities, and the ability to respond to threats without directly risking Iranian territory or personnel. Most importantly, they served as Iran's primary deterrent against regime change efforts. The proxy strategy also addressed Iran's fundamental geographic vulnerability. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and facing potential naval blockades, Iran needed external pressure valves. The proxy network created multiple fronts where Iran could apply pressure against enemies while avoiding direct confrontation. It was asymmetric warfare on a regional scale, allowing a relatively isolated Iran to punch far above its military weight. Tehran invested decades building personal relationships with proxy leadership. Iranian commanders attended weddings, funerals, and religious ceremonies with their counterparts across the network. They shared intelligence, coordinated training programs, and developed joint operational plans. These weren't transactional relationships, but carefully cultivated partnerships that Iran believed would endure through any crisis. The Revolutionary Guard treated proxy leaders as extended family members, complete with the loyalty such relationships implied. The system also created multiple layers of redundancy. If one proxy group faced internal problems or external pressure, others could compensate. Iran never expected to lose all its proxies simultaneously because the network was specifically designed to prevent such catastrophic failure. Financial flows supported more than just military operations. Iran funded hospitals, schools, and social services in areas controlled by proxy groups. This created popular support bases that would theoretically resist any attempts to separate these groups from Iranian backing. Training programs brought thousands of proxy fighters to Iran over the years, creating personal bonds that transcended mere business relationships. These fighters learned Iranian tactical doctrines, met Iranian commanders, and developed emotional connections to Iran's revolutionary ideology. They returned to their home territories as advocates for maintaining Iranian alliance structures. Iran assumed these personal relationships would survive political pressures and military setbacks. The proxy network was supposed to be self-reinforcing. Success by one group would inspire others while demonstrating Iran's value as a patron. Each proxy success was meant to strengthen the entire system by proving Iran's strategic vision and operational capabilities. Failure by individual groups was supposed to be impossible because other network members would provide support and compensation. Intelligence sharing represented another crucial network function. Iranian proxies provided eyes and ears across multiple countries, feeding information back to Tehran about enemy movements, local political developments, and emerging threats. This intelligence network allowed Iran to anticipate problems and coordinate responses before enemies could gain decisive advantages. The proxy groups weren't just military assets but information-gathering operations that enhanced Iran's situational awareness across the region. But something went fundamentally wrong with this carefully constructed system. Despite decades of investment, despite personal relationships spanning generations, despite shared ideological commitments, the network began showing cracks that widened into chasms. Early warning signs appeared in 2024 when coordination between proxy groups started breaking down. Joint operations became less frequent. Intelligence sharing slowed. Response times to Iranian directives increased. Israel's October 2024 airstrike that crippled a key missile production facility in Iran demonstrated just how vulnerable the network had become. By 2025, the unthinkable had happened. Iran's calls for coordinated action were met with silence. Proxy groups that had once jumped at Tehran's slightest suggestion now ignored direct orders. The network that was supposed to guarantee Iran's survival had simply stopped responding. The question wasn't whether individual relationships had soured, but whether the entire strategic framework had become obsolete. Something had broken the bonds that Iran thought were unbreakable, and the first crack appeared in the most basic element of any relationship, the money. When the money stopped flowing, financial collapse hit Iran's proxy network with surgical precision. Proxy funding faced at least a 50 to 60% reduction due to new sanctions, transforming decades of careful relationship building into a desperate scramble for survival. The financial pipeline that sustained Iran's regional influence for decades had been cut to a trickle, and the consequences were cascading across the Middle East in ways Tehran never anticipated. The economic pressures crushing Iran's proxy funding began building throughout 2024 as international sanctions reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. Unlike previous sanctions regimes that focused on broad economic sectors, the 2024 measures specifically targeted the financial mechanisms Iran used to support proxy operations. The new sanctions program blocked both formal banking channels and Hawala money transfer systems that had moved hundreds of millions to proxy accounts across the region. Banking channels that had sustained Hezbollah operations in Lebanon suddenly dried up. Cryptocurrency networks that facilitated Houthi payments faced coordinated international shutdowns. Even the informal Hawala systems that had long evaded Western oversight found themselves under intense scrutiny and pressure. Iran's domestic economic situation made these external pressures exponentially worse. Inflation surged above 40% throughout 2024, forcing ordinary Iranians to choose between basic necessities and political support for the regime. The Iranian rial lost substantial value against the dollar, making foreign weapons purchases and proxy support payments dramatically more expensive. Tehran faced a stark choice that previous generations of Iranian leadership had never confronted: maintain domestic stability or continue funding proxy operations. The regime chose survival over influence. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis all experienced funding shortfalls that halted new arms shipments and forced dramatic operational changes. Hamas operations in Gaza, which had relied on steady monthly payments from Iran, suddenly found themselves operating on emergency reserves by late 2024. Training programs stopped. New weapon acquisitions ceased. Even basic operational expenses like vehicle fuel and communications equipment became luxuries that Hamas leadership had to carefully ration. Hezbollah faced even more dramatic cuts. The organization's massive social service network in southern Lebanon, which had provided healthcare, education, and economic support to hundreds of thousands of Shia residents, began shutting down programs. Hezbollah-run hospitals reduced services. Schools closed early. Hezbollah's stipend cuts forced 70% of fighters to take government jobs as the organization could no longer afford to maintain its traditional patronage system. These weren't temporary belt-tightening measures, but fundamental changes to how Hezbollah operated as both a military force and social movement. The Houthis in Yemen discovered that their sophisticated naval operations required consistent funding streams that Iran could no longer provide. The drone boats and anti-ship missiles that had terrorized Red Sea shipping throughout 2023 required constant maintenance, fuel, and replacement parts. Without steady Iranian financial support, Houthi naval capabilities degraded rapidly. Operations that had once launched weekly now occurred monthly, then stopped altogether as technical failures mounted and spare parts became unavailable. Specific instances of Iranian funding failures began emerging throughout 2020 that revealed the depth of Tehran's financial crisis. Hamas leadership reportedly requested emergency funding to prepare for potential Israeli ground operations in Gaza. Iran's response was silence. Hezbollah commanders asked for funds to upgrade their missile defense systems. Again, Tehran couldn't deliver. The Houthis requested additional anti-aircraft systems to defend against coalition airstrikes. Iran offered technical advice, but no actual hardware or funding. These funding shortfalls forced proxy groups to make decisions that had been unthinkable just years earlier. Hamas began reaching out to Qatar and other Gulf states for financial support, essentially shopping for new patrons who might replace Iranian backing. Hezbollah started selling some of its Iranian-provided weapons on black markets to raise cash for basic operations. The Houthis began negotiating directly with Saudi Arabia about potential ceasefires, cutting Iran out of discussions entirely. Alternative funding sources created new dependency relationships that naturally reduced Iranian influence. When Qatar provided Hamas with emergency funding in late 2024, those payments came with conditions about how the money could be used and what operations it could support. Gulf states weren't interested in funding anti-Israeli operations, but were willing to pay for humanitarian programs and governance activities. Hamas leadership found themselves managing competing patron relationships for the first time, with Iranian and Arab funding sources pulling in different directions. The psychological impact of financial abandonment proved as damaging as the material consequences. Proxy group leaders who had spent decades building personal relationships with Iranian commanders suddenly found their calls unreturned. Meetings that had been scheduled months in advance were canceled without explanation. Iranian advisors who had embedded with proxy operations for years began quietly withdrawing, citing budget constraints and operational priorities elsewhere. Internal debates within proxy organizations intensified as Iranian funding disappeared. Younger Hamas commanders questioned whether continued loyalty to Tehran made sense when Iran couldn't provide basic operational support. Hezbollah political leaders argued that the organization's future lay in Lebanese politics rather than Iranian regional strategy. Houthi tribal leaders suggested that local Yemeni concerns should take priority over Iranian geopolitical objectives. Iranian attempts to maintain influence without providing actual funding exposed the transactional nature of relationships that Tehran had believed were based on shared ideology. Revolutionary Guard commanders offered increased training opportunities to compensate for reduced financial support, but proxy groups needed immediate operational funding more than long-term capability development. Iranian promises of future weapons deliveries couldn't replace the cash flows that kept proxy organizations functioning on a day-to-day basis. By early 2025, the pattern had become undeniable. Iran's financial crisis hadn't just reduced proxy funding temporarily, but had fundamentally severed the economic relationships that sustained Iranian regional influence. Proxy groups were operating as independent organizations, making autonomous decisions based on local rather than Iranian priorities. The financial lifeline that had connected Tehran to allied organizations across the Middle East had been cut, and neither side seemed interested in repairing the connection. But Iran's isolation extended far beyond its proxy relationships. The silence from Tehran's most important strategic partners revealed an even more devastating reality about Iran's position in the international system. Russia and China's strategic retreat. Moscow and Beijing's diplomatic calendars tell the story more clearly than any official statement could. Iran's last official high-level visit to Russia or China was over 8 months ago, marking the longest period without substantive contact since these partnerships began. The silence represents a calculated strategic retreat that would have been unthinkable just 3 years ago. Russia's abandonment of Iranian partnership reflects Moscow's brutal realization that supporting Tehran has become a luxury it can no longer afford. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has consumed Russian military resources and diplomatic capital to such an extent that Moscow simply lacks bandwidth for meaningful Middle Eastern commitments beyond protecting its own Syrian interests. The S-400 air defense systems that Iran desperately wanted never materialized because Russia needed every available unit for its own territorial defense. Russian weapon systems that once flowed to Iranian forces through Syria have been redirected to Ukrainian front lines where they serve immediate Russian survival needs rather than long-term geopolitical positioning. Military cooperation between Iran and Russia, which had expanded significantly through 2022 and early 2023, ground to a halt throughout 2024 as Russian priorities shifted decisively toward European rather than Middle Eastern theaters. Joint training exercises that had been scheduled for late 2024 were canceled without rescheduling. Russian military advisors who had been embedded with Iranian forces in Syria began withdrawing quietly in the fall of 2024. Even the drone technology sharing agreements that had been a cornerstone of Iran-Russia cooperation became inconsistent as Moscow prioritized its own drone production for Ukrainian operations over export commitments to Tehran. China's economic calculations proved even more devastating to Iranian hopes for great power backing. China's trade with Gulf neighbors rose to $200 billion in 2024 according to size data, while China-Iran bilateral trade fell to $45 billion. These economic partnerships dwarf China's reduced trade relationship with Iran, creating a stark choice for Beijing between supporting Iran's confrontational regional policies or maintaining lucrative economic relationships with Iran's Arab neighbors. The math was simple and brutal. Specific instances of Russian and Chinese abandonment began accumulating throughout 2024 in ways that revealed the depth of Tehran's isolation. Russia abstained on UN sanctions snapback in 2022, choosing neutrality over the automatic support Iran had expected. China allowed the arms embargo to lapse in October 2023 when the Security Council voted on sanctions related to Iranian proxy support, with Beijing choosing abstention over blocking the measure. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern where both nations began treating Iran as a liability rather than an asset in international forums. Behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure from Western nations played a crucial role in accelerating this great power retreat from Iranian partnership. American and European officials made clear to both Moscow and Beijing that continued support for Iranian regional activities would complicate other bilateral relationships and potentially trigger additional sanctions targeting Russia-Iran and China-Iran economic cooperation. The message was delivered through multiple diplomatic channels throughout 2024. Supporting Iran's destabilizing activities would carry costs in other areas of great power competition that neither Russia nor China were prepared to pay. European diplomatic efforts proved particularly effective in driving wedges between Iran and its great power partners. French and German officials offered both Russia and China enhanced cooperation in specific economic sectors conditional on reduced support for Iranian regional activities. These weren't ultimatums, but carefully crafted incentive structures that made abandoning Iran more attractive than maintaining partnership. Russian energy companies receive hints about potential sanctions relief if Moscow reduced Iranian cooperation. Chinese technology firms were offered expanded European market access in exchange for limiting Iranian economic support. Iran's increasing isolation made partnership with Tehran actively counterproductive for both Russia and China in ways that fundamentally altered their cost-benefit calculations. Russian officials discovered that association with Iranian regional activities complicated Moscow's relationships with Arab nations that Russia needed for energy market cooperation and geopolitical influence. Chinese diplomats found that supporting Iranian positions in international forums damaged Beijing's carefully cultivated relationships with Gulf states that represented far more valuable economic and strategic partnerships than anything Iran could offer. Intelligence sharing arrangements that had been central to Iran-Russia-China cooperation began breaking down throughout 2024 as both nations reduced their commitment to Iranian strategic objectives. Russian satellite intelligence that had helped Iranian forces track Israeli and American military movements in the region became sporadic and then stopped entirely. Chinese cyber intelligence capabilities that had supported Iranian operations against Western targets were quietly withdrawn as Beijing calculated that such cooperation risked escalating tensions with the United States beyond acceptable levels. Economic cooperation agreements that had seemed solid just 2 years earlier began collapsing under the weight of international pressure and changed strategic priorities. The Iran-China 25-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed with great fanfare in 2021, saw its implementation timeline pushed back repeatedly throughout 2024 before being quietly shelved in early 2025. Russian commitments to invest in Iranian energy infrastructure similarly evaporated as Moscow redirected resources toward domestic reconstruction needs and European energy relationship repair efforts. The psychological impact of great power abandonment proved as devastating as the material consequences for Iranian strategic planning. Iranian officials who had built entire careers around managing relationships with Russia and China suddenly found their expertise irrelevant as those partnerships withered. Revolutionary Guard commanders who had assumed Russian military support would always be available had to completely revise their strategic assumptions about Iranian capabilities and limitations. Without reliable Russian arms and Chinese trade, Iran lost both its military shield and economic lifeline. The confidence that had sustained Iranian regional ambitions for decades began cracking under the weight of isolation that now included even Iran's most important international partners. But Iran's nightmare was only beginning as the regional diplomatic landscape, the Abraham Accords 2.0 effect. Arab-Israeli normalization accelerated throughout 2024 and 2025 in ways that fundamentally rewrote Middle Eastern geopolitics and left Iran scrambling to maintain relevance. What began as the Abraham Accords in 2020 evolved into something far more comprehensive and devastating to Iranian strategic interests. The diplomatic momentum that started with UAE and Bahraini recognition of Israel accelerated into a region-wide transformation that isolated Iran more completely than any military campaign or sanctions regime ever could. Morocco's deepening ties with Israel throughout 2024 demonstrated the practical benefits of normalization that other Arab nations couldn't ignore. Moroccan-Israeli trade jumped from virtually nothing to over $200 million in bilateral commerce by late 2024, with Israeli technology companies establishing significant operations in Casablanca and Rabat. Israeli agricultural expertise helped Morocco increase crop yields by 30% in drought-affected regions, while Israeli cybersecurity firms provided critical infrastructure protection. These weren't symbolic diplomatic gestures, but concrete economic partnerships that delivered measurable benefits to ordinary Moroccan citizens. Sudan's quiet normalization with Israel accelerated throughout 2024 despite the country's internal political turmoil. Israeli humanitarian organizations provided medical supplies and technical expertise during Sudan's ongoing crisis, while Israeli agricultural consultants helped Sudanese farmers adapt to climate change impacts. The relationship developed organically through practical cooperation rather than formal diplomatic announcements, creating facts on the ground that made Iranian opposition irrelevant. Sudanese officials discovered that Israeli partnership offered immediate solutions to pressing problems, while Iranian support provided only ideological solidarity without material benefits. Saudi Arabia's continued diplomatic engagement with Israel throughout 2024 and 2025 represented the most significant blow to Iranian regional positioning. While formal diplomatic recognition remained elusive, practical cooperation between Riyadh and Jerusalem expanded dramatically across multiple sectors. Saudi and Israeli intelligence agencies coordinated counterterrorism operations targeting Iranian proxy activities in the region. Saudi businesses began exploring joint ventures with Israeli technology companies through third-party arrangements in Dubai and Bahrain. Even Saudi religious authorities began moderating their rhetoric about Israel in ways that prepared public opinion for eventual formal recognition. The economic incentives driving Arab states toward cooperation with Israel rather than confrontation became impossible to ignore by 2025. Israeli technology exports to Arab nations that had normalized relations exceeded $2 billion annually, providing everything from water desalination systems to advanced medical equipment. Israeli agricultural innovation helped Gulf states reduce food import dependency by 15% through improved crop production techniques adapted to desert climates. These partnerships created stakeholder constituencies within Arab societies that had direct economic interests in maintaining positive relationships with Israel regardless of Iranian objections. Iran's traditional narrative of Arab solidarity against Israel lost credibility as more Arab nations discovered that cooperation with Israel delivered tangible benefits while confrontation offered only continued regional instability. The Palestinian cause, which Iran had long used to justify its proxy network and regional interference, became increasingly disconnected from Arab state priorities as governments focused on economic development and domestic stability rather than ideological confrontation. Arab publics began questioning why their governments should sacrifice economic opportunities and regional peace for the sake of Iranian geopolitical objectives. Specific instances throughout 2024 revealed how Arab states were actively choosing Israeli partnerships over Iranian relationships when forced to make such decisions. When Iran requested that Jordan close its airspace to Israeli civilian flights in response to regional tensions, Jordan not only refused but expanded its aviation cooperation agreements with Israel. The UAE ignored Iranian pressure to cancel joint Israeli-Emirati military exercises, proceeding with the training programs despite threats of Iranian retaliation. Bahrain continued expanding its Israeli diplomatic presence even after Iranian proxies threatened attacks against Israeli personnel in Manama. The normalization trend made Iran's proxy strategy appear not just unsuccessful, but actively counterproductive to regional stability and prosperity. Arab governments that had once tolerated Iranian proxy activities as necessary evils in the struggle against Israel began viewing these same activities as obstacles to beneficial cooperation with Jerusalem. Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon became a liability that prevented Lebanese integration into regional economic partnerships. Hamas's control of Gaza blocked Palestinian participation in Israeli-Arab cooperation initiatives. Qatar's complex balancing act between Iranian accommodation and Israeli engagement showed how even Iran's supposed Arab allies were hedging their relationships throughout 2024 and 2025. While Qatar maintained its hosting of Hamas leadership, Qatari businesses quietly expanded their cooperation with Israeli companies through Dubai-based intermediaries. Qatari investment funds purchased stakes in Israeli technology startups, while Qatari energy companies explored potential cooperation with Israeli natural gas developers. These activities proceeded despite Iranian objections and Hamas' presence in Doha, suggesting that economic logic was overriding ideological solidarity. Intelligence sharing between Arab states and Israel expanded significantly throughout 2024, creating security cooperation networks that explicitly excluded Iranian participation. Saudi, Emirati, and Israeli intelligence agencies developed joint assessment capabilities targeting Iranian activities across the region. These arrangements provided Arab partners with enhanced security capabilities while giving Israel unprecedented insight into regional Iranian operations. The cooperation created strategic advantages for all participants while further marginalizing Iranian influence. Technology transfer agreements between Israel and Arab partners accelerated throughout 2025, creating long-term dependencies that made reversal of normalization increasingly difficult. Israeli cybersecurity systems protected critical Arab infrastructure, while Israeli medical technology improved healthcare outcomes in partner nations. These technical relationships created expertise gaps that Arab nations filled through Israeli partnership rather than developing independent capabilities or seeking Iranian alternatives. Iran found itself on the wrong side of a regional transformation that had fundamentally altered Middle Eastern strategic dynamics. The Arab world had discovered that cooperation with Israel delivered concrete benefits, while confrontation offered only continued instability and economic stagnation. Iranian revolutionary ideology had become incompatible with Arab developmental priorities, leaving Tehran isolated in a region that had moved beyond the zero-sum confrontational frameworks that had defined Iranian strategy for decades. But perhaps nowhere was this isolation more visible than in the behavior of Iran's most prominent proxy force, which had begun making decisions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Hamas goes silent. Hamas leadership stopped answering Tehran's calls in late 2024, marking the end of one of Iran's most crucial proxy relationships. The organization that had once executed Iranian strategic directives without question began ignoring direct communications from Revolutionary Guard commanders. Iranian requests for coordinated operations received no response. Calls for escalation against Israeli targets were met with complete silence. The communication channels that had functioned smoothly for over 2 decades essentially shut down, leaving Iranian officials confronting the unprecedented reality that their primary proxy in Gaza was no longer taking orders. Gaza's devastation fundamentally altered Hamas's strategic calculations in ways Iranian planners never anticipated. The organization that had built its identity around resistance to Israeli occupation found itself managing the complete collapse of basic infrastructure supporting 2 million Palestinian civilians. Water treatment facilities destroyed. Electrical grids non-existent. Medical systems overwhelmed beyond capacity. Hamas leadership discovered that maintaining any semblance of governance required different priorities than those demanded by Iranian regional strategy. The choice became stark: serve Iranian geopolitical objectives or prevent total societal collapse in Gaza. Hamas commanders who had spent years coordinating with Iranian advisors began questioning whether continued Iranian alliance justified the massive costs being imposed on Palestinian civilians. Internal leadership debates throughout late 2024 focused increasingly on whether Iranian support was worth the continued destruction that Iranian-directed operations brought down on Gaza. Senior Hamas officials started arguing that Iranian strategic objectives and Palestinian survival needs had become incompatible. These weren't abstract philosophical discussions, but urgent practical conversations about organizational survival and responsibility to constituents. Specific instances throughout 2024 revealed Hamas's growing willingness to ignore Iranian calls for escalation in favor of protecting remaining Gaza infrastructure. In August 2024, Iranian commanders requested that Hamas launch rocket attacks to coincide with regional tensions involving Hezbollah. Hamas declined, citing the need to preserve remaining military capabilities for defensive purposes. In October 2024, Iran asked Hamas to coordinate with Houthi operations in the Red Sea by increasing pressure on Israeli southern communities. Again, Hamas refused, prioritizing local stability over regional coordination. Iranian requests for Hamas to target Israeli civilian infrastructure in November 2024 were similarly ignored, as Hamas leadership calculated that such operations would trigger Israeli retaliation that Gaza's weakened infrastructure couldn't survive. The organization that had once competed with other Iranian proxies to demonstrate loyalty to Tehran was now regularly declining Iranian operational requests. Hamas had begun making independent calculations about cost and benefit that frequently contradicted Iranian strategic preferences. Egyptian and Qatari mediation efforts throughout 2024 and 2025 explicitly excluded Iranian participation, marginalizing Tehran in discussions about Gaza's future. Cairo and Doha made clear that Iranian involvement in ceasefire negotiations was counterproductive to achieving sustainable agreements. Hamas participated in these Iranian-free discussions without protest, effectively endorsing the exclusion of their former patron from decisions about Gaza's political future. Egyptian officials offered Hamas alternative support structures that didn't require Iranian approval or coordination. Qatar's role as mediator between Hamas and Israel created new dependency relationships that naturally reduced Iranian influence. Qatari payments to Hamas for civilian governance functions came without the operational strings that Iranian support had always carried. Hamas leadership discovered that Qatari funding allowed them to focus on internal Palestinian concerns rather than external Iranian objectives. The organization began viewing Tehran as a complication rather than an asset in securing international support for Gaza reconstruction. Hamas's focus shifted decisively from attacking Israel to rebuilding governance structures in Gaza throughout 2025. The organization allocated its remaining resources to restoring basic services rather than military operations. Hamas officials began meeting with international aid organizations to coordinate reconstruction efforts rather than with Iranian military advisors to plan attacks. The transformation from resistance movement to governing authority required different skills and different international relationships than those Iranian partnership provided. Administrative priorities replaced military priorities in Hamas planning documents throughout 2025. The organization published detailed plans for rebuilding Gaza's educational system, healthcare network, and economic infrastructure. These documents made no reference to Iranian strategic objectives or regional resistance goals. Hamas had begun operating as a local Palestinian organization rather than an Iranian proxy, with correspondingly different priorities and international relationships. Iran's inability to protect Gaza during periods of intense Israeli military pressure undermined Tehran's credibility as a patron in ways that reverberated throughout the proxy network. Hamas fighters questioned why they should risk their lives for Iranian objectives when Iran couldn't provide meaningful protection during crises. The organization that had promoted Iranian revolutionary ideology discovered that Iranian support meant little when Gaza faced existential threats. Iranian promises of future support rang hollow when immediate protection needs went unmet. Iranian attempts to reassert influence over Hamas through alternative channels proved unsuccessful throughout 2025. Revolutionary Guard efforts to contact Hamas through Lebanese and Syrian intermediaries were rebuffed. Iranian offers of increased future support in exchange for renewed cooperation were dismissed by Hamas leadership as unrealistic given Iran's demonstrated financial constraints. The personal relationships that had sustained Iranian-Hamas cooperation for decades appear to have been permanently damaged by Iran's inability to prevent Gaza's devastation. Hamas's transformation from Iranian proxy to independent Palestinian organization accelerated throughout 2025 as the group developed new international relationships that didn't require Iranian approval. European aid organizations began working directly with Hamas on reconstruction projects. Arab governments started engaging Hamas leadership on regional stability issues. These new relationships provided Hamas with alternatives to Iranian support while requiring the organization to moderate its positions in ways that conflicted with Iranian regional strategy. Iranian officials privately acknowledged by early 2025 that Hamas had effectively gone rogue, operating independently of Iranian direction for the first time since the relationship began. The silence from Gaza represented more than tactical disagreement or temporary cooling of relations. Hamas had fundamentally re-evaluated its relationship with Iran and concluded that Iranian alliance offered fewer benefits than costs in the current regional environment. Iran's most visible and historically reliable proxy had chosen survival over solidarity, leaving Tehran without its primary asset in the ongoing struggle against Israeli influence. But Hamas wasn't the only Iranian proxy facing impossible choices between Iranian loyalty and local survival. In Lebanon, an even more complex drama was unfolding as Iran's most powerful proxy confronted pressures that would test the very foundation of their decades-long alliance. Hezbollah's Lebanese dilemma. Hezbollah's position in Lebanon became untenable as the organization faced impossible choices between Iranian loyalty and Lebanese survival. Lebanese society turned against Hezbollah with an intensity that would have been unimaginable just 3 years earlier. The organization that once commanded widespread respect among Shia communities and grudging acceptance from other Lebanese sects now faced open hostility from citizens who blamed Hezbollah's Iranian agenda for Lebanon's catastrophic economic collapse. Protests in Shia-majority areas of southern Lebanon throughout 2024 specifically targeted Hezbollah offices, with demonstrators demanding that the organization prioritize Lebanese reconstruction over Iranian regional objectives. Lebanon's economic collapse reached previously unimaginable depths throughout 2024 and 2025, creating pressures that forced Hezbollah to choose between Iranian loyalty and basic organizational survival. The Lebanese pound lost another 85% of its remaining value against the dollar throughout 2024, making even basic imports prohibitively expensive for ordinary citizens. Electricity became available for less than 2 hours daily in most areas. Banking system paralysis meant that Lebanese citizens couldn't access their own savings accounts. Hezbollah discovered that maintaining Iranian alliance required resources that could instead address the humanitarian crisis consuming their core constituencies. The organization's massive social service network faced impossible choices between maintaining Iranian operational commitments and serving Lebanese community needs. Hezbollah-run hospitals that had once provided free medical care began charging fees that most Shia families couldn't afford. Schools operated by the organization reduced their operating hours and eliminated programs that had served thousands of students. The monthly stipends that had kept Hezbollah fighters and their families loyal to the organization were cut by 60% as resources became unavailable. Israeli military capabilities demonstrated throughout 2024 made Hezbollah leadership completely recalculate the costs of confrontation with Israel. The precision strike capabilities that Israel exhibited against Iranian targets showed Hezbollah commanders that their own military infrastructure faced similar vulnerabilities. Israeli intelligence penetration of Hezbollah communications networks, revealed through several successful targeted operations, convinced the organization that its operational security had been compromised in ways that made large-scale confrontation with Israel potentially suicidal. Internal Hezbollah debates throughout 2024 and 2025 focused increasingly on whether Iranian support justified the enormous risks to Lebanese Shia communities that Iranian strategic objectives created. Senior Hezbollah commanders argued that Iran's financial support had already disappeared while Iranian demands for military readiness continued. Younger organization leaders questioned whether Hezbollah's future lay in Lebanese politics rather than regional resistance, pointing out that the organization's electoral success provided more concrete benefits to Shia constituencies than Iranian military cooperation. Specific instances throughout 2024 revealed Hezbollah's growing willingness to decline Iranian requests for action against Israeli or Western targets. In June 2024, Iran asked Hezbollah to target Israeli military installations in response to Israeli strikes against Iranian facilities in Syria. Hezbollah leadership declined, citing concerns about Israeli retaliation against Lebanese civilian infrastructure. In September 2024, Iranian commanders requested Hezbollah assistance in attacking American diplomatic facilities in Lebanon. Again, Hezbollah refused, calculating that such operations would trigger international sanctions that Lebanon's economy couldn't survive. French diplomatic efforts throughout 2024 proved remarkably successful at driving wedges between Hezbollah and Iran by offering the organization alternative pathways to political legitimacy and economic support. French officials made clear that Hezbollah's integration into Lebanese democratic processes required distancing the organization from Iranian military operations. Paris offered increased aid to Lebanese institutions where Hezbollah held influence, conditional on the organization moderating its Iranian connections. These incentives provided Hezbollah with concrete benefits for reducing Iranian cooperation. American diplomatic pressure complemented French efforts by making the costs of continued Iranian alliance increasingly clear to Hezbollah leadership. Washington expanded sanctions targeting Hezbollah's financial networks while simultaneously offering sanctions relief for Lebanese institutions that could demonstrate independence from Iranian influence. The message was clear: continued Iranian cooperation would bring additional costs, while reduced Iranian ties could provide economic benefits that Lebanon desperately needed. Hezbollah's deep integration into Lebanon's political system created competing loyalties that made exclusive Iranian allegiance increasingly difficult to maintain. The organization held multiple cabinet positions, controlled significant parliamentary representation, and managed substantial government resources that came with responsibilities to Lebanese rather than Iranian constituencies. These political roles required Hezbollah to consider Lebanese national interests that frequently conflicted with Iranian regional objectives. Iran's inability to provide meaningful economic aid to Lebanon throughout 2024 and 2025 severely weakened Iranian influence over Hezbollah decision-making. Tehran's promises of financial support for Lebanese reconstruction never materialized as Iran's own economic crisis deepened. Hezbollah leadership discovered that Iranian alliance offered ideological solidarity, but no concrete solutions to the humanitarian crisis facing their constituencies. The organization began seeking alternative international relationships that could provide actual economic benefits rather than revolutionary rhetoric. Lebanese government efforts to assert sovereignty over Hezbollah's military capabilities gained momentum throughout 2024 as the organization faced pressure from multiple directions. Beirut offered Hezbollah integration into official Lebanese security forces in exchange for ending independent military operations. The proposal provided the organization with a pathway to maintain its military capabilities while reducing Iranian influence over operational decisions. Hezbollah's quiet drift away from Iranian strategic direction accelerated throughout 2025 as the organization prioritized Lebanese political survival over Iranian regional objectives. The group that had once served as Iran's most reliable proxy in the Levant was now making autonomous decisions based on Lebanese rather than Iranian calculations. But Hezbollah wasn't alone in this strategic recalculation, as Iranian proxies across the region began questioning whether Tehran's the Houthis calculate new odds. In Yemen, the Houthis discovered that Iranian partnership had become a strategic liability that threatened their core territorial objectives. The naval coalition protecting Red Sea shipping lanes expanded from 12 nations in early 2024 to over 20 countries by 2025, creating a surveillance and response network that made Houthi maritime attacks increasingly suicidal rather than strategically effective. Advanced radar systems, coordinated patrol schedules, and real-time intelligence sharing meant that Houthi naval operations faced immediate multinational responses that overwhelmed their defensive capabilities. The organization that had once terrorized commercial shipping with relative impunity discovered that continued attacks now triggered massive retaliation that devastated their coastal infrastructure and eliminated their operational capacity for weeks at a time. Coalition operations dramatically increased the costs of each Houthi Red Sea attack while reducing their strategic effectiveness to near zero. American, British, French, and Italian naval forces coordinated with Saudi, Egyptian, and Jordanian assets to create overlapping defensive zones that made successful Houthi attacks virtually impossible. The coalition's rules of engagement evolved throughout 2024 to allow preemptive strikes against Houthi launching positions, meaning that even preparing attacks triggered immediate retaliation. Houthi commanders discovered that each attempted maritime operation cost them dozens of fighters, multiple launching sites, and significant stockpiles of Iranian-provided weapons while achieving minimal strategic impact on international shipping patterns. Coalition forces demonstrated their enhanced capabilities through devastating strikes against Houthi naval infrastructure throughout late 2024 and early 2025. Precision bombing of Houthi naval bases eliminated months of Iranian weapons accumulation in single operations. Advanced surveillance capabilities allowed coalition forces to track Houthi movements in real time, making surprise attacks impossible while enabling targeted elimination of Houthi leadership. The technological gap between coalition capabilities and Houthi defenses had widened to such an extent that continued maritime operations represented organizational suicide rather than strategic resistance. Saudi Arabia's diplomatic overtures to the Houthis throughout 2024 offered the organization an alternative to Iranian patronage that addressed their core territorial and political objectives without requiring continued confrontation with international coalitions. Riyadh's negotiating position acknowledged Houthi control over significant Yemeni territory while offering pathways to international recognition that Iranian alliance explicitly prevented. Saudi officials made clear that normalization of Houthi governance could proceed rapidly if the organization distanced itself from Iranian regional objectives and ended provocative maritime operations. These negotiations offered the Houthis concrete benefits for reducing Iranian cooperation rather than abstract promises of future support. Internal Houthi debates throughout 2024 and 2025 focused increasingly on whether continued Iranian alignment served core Yemeni interests or simply exposed the organization to unsustainable international pressure. Senior Houthi commanders argued that Iranian support had become a liability that prevented the organization from achieving its primary objective of consolidating territorial control within Yemen. Younger Houthi leaders pointed out that Iranian financial support had disappeared while Iranian demands for maritime operations continued, creating a relationship that imposed costs without providing benefits. These internal discussions reflected broader questions about whether Houthi identity was primarily Yemeni or Iranian in orientation. The organization's territorial priorities began diverging from Iranian regional objectives as Houthi leadership calculated that consolidating control within Yemen required different strategies than those demanded by Iranian proxy coordination. Houthi resources allocated to Red Sea operations could instead secure additional Yemeni territory or improve governance capabilities in areas under their control. The mathematical reality became clear. Iranian regional strategy required Houthi sacrifices that didn't advance core Yemeni interests and actively prevented achievement of domestic political objectives. Specific instances throughout 2024 revealed the Houthis' growing willingness to ignore Iranian directives when those orders conflicted with Yemeni priorities. In July 2024, Iranian commanders requested increased Houthi attacks on Israeli-linked shipping to coordinate with broader regional tensions. The Houthis declined, citing the need to preserve their remaining naval capabilities for defensive purposes. In October 2024, Iran asked the Houthis to escalate maritime operations to support Iranian negotiations with European powers. Again, the Houthis refused, prioritizing their own diplomatic initiatives with Saudi Arabia over Iranian regional strategy. Iranian requests for the Houthis to target American naval assets in November 2024 were similarly ignored as Houthi leadership calculated that such operations would trigger retaliation that could eliminate their organization entirely. The group that had once competed with other Iranian proxies to demonstrate loyalty to Tehran was now regularly declining Iranian operational requests. Houthi decision-making had shifted from automatic compliance with Iranian directives to independent cost-benefit analysis that frequently contradicted Iranian preferences. United Nations mediation efforts in Yemen throughout 2024 and 2025 explicitly excluded Iranian participation, creating diplomatic processes that marginalized Tehran while offering the Houthis pathways to international legitimacy. UN special envoys made clear that Iranian involvement in Yemeni peace negotiations was counterproductive to achieving sustainable agreements. The Houthis participated in these Iranian-free discussions without objection, effectively endorsing the exclusion of their former patron from decisions about Yemen's political future. Saudi-Houthi dialogue improved dramatically throughout 2024 as both sides discovered mutual interests in ending the destructive conflict that had consumed Yemen for nearly a decade. Riyadh offered economic reconstruction assistance, international recognition, and political integration opportunities that Iranian alliance explicitly prevented. These negotiations provided the Houthis with tangible benefits for reducing Iranian cooperation while addressing their core territorial and political objectives within Yemen. The Houthis quietly reduced their most provocative maritime activities throughout 2025 despite continued Iranian pressure to maintain Red Sea operations. Attack frequencies dropped dramatically as the organization prioritized preserving their remaining military capabilities rather than expending them on operations that served Iranian regional strategy without advancing Yemeni interests. The group that had once terrorized international shipping began operating as a conventional territorial authority focused on governing rather than resistance activities that brought unsustainable international pressure. Iran's proxy network was collapsing across multiple theaters simultaneously, but perhaps nowhere was this abandonment more shocking than in the country where Iranian influence had seemed most secure. In Iraq, where Iranian advisors had operated with near impunity for 2 decades, a quiet revolution was underway that would challenge the very foundation of Tehran's regional strategy. Iraq's militias choose Baghdad over Tehran. Iraqi Shia militias that had once jumped at Iranian commands now take their orders from Baghdad, marking one of the most dramatic reversals in Iranian regional influence since the 2003 American invasion. The Popular Mobilization Forces, which had operated as de facto Iranian proxies for over a decade, began responding exclusively to Iraqi government directives throughout 2024 and 2025. Militia commanders who had maintained direct communication channels with Revolutionary Guard officers in Tehran started routing all operational decisions through Iraqi Defense Ministry officials instead. The transformation wasn't gradual but decisive, with militia groups publicly announcing their allegiance to Iraqi rather than Iranian authority in ceremonies broadcast on Iraqi state television. Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammad Shia al-Sudani's sovereignty campaign throughout 2024 and 2025 successfully asserted Baghdad's control over militia activities that had previously operated independently of government oversight. The campaign began with direct orders requiring all armed groups to integrate into official Iraqi security forces or face dissolution. Al-Sudani backed these demands with concrete actions, including the arrest of militia commanders who refused integration orders and the seizure of weapons stockpiles that hadn't been registered with Iraqi authorities. The Prime Minister's office issued weekly statements throughout 2024 emphasizing that no armed groups could operate on Iraqi soil without explicit government authorization. The integration process forced militia groups to choose between Iranian loyalty and continued existence within Iraq's legal framework. Groups that had received Iranian funding for over 15 years discovered that maintaining Iranian connections meant losing their legal status, government salaries, and operational legitimacy within Iraq. The Badr organization, Asayb al-Haq, and Kataib Hezbollah all announced their full integration into Iraqi security forces by late 2024, effectively ending their status as Iranian proxy organizations. These announcements came with public ceremonies, where militia leaders swore oaths of allegiance to the Iraqi constitution rather than Iranian revolutionary ideology. American diplomatic pressure combined with rising Iraqi nationalism to create an environment where Iranian influence became politically toxic rather than strategically valuable. The Biden administration's Iraq strategy throughout 2024 offered significant economic incentives for reducing Iranian militia influence while threatening consequences for continued Iranian proxy activities. American officials made clear that Iraq's access to international banking systems, energy sector investments, and security cooperation depended on Baghdad's ability to control Iranian-backed militias. These weren't ultimatums but carefully structured incentive packages that made choosing Iraqi sovereignty more attractive than maintaining Iranian dependence. Economic incentives provided Iraqi militias with concrete reasons to support government stability over Iranian regional agenda throughout 2024 and 2025. Integration into official Iraqi security forces meant regular salaries, benefits packages, and pension systems that Iranian support had never provided. Militia fighters discovered that government service offered economic security for their families, while Iranian proxy activities provided only irregular payments and constant security risks. Iraqi government employment delivered predictable income, while Iranian alliance offered uncertain compensation for dangerous activities. Iraq's economic recovery throughout 2024 created additional incentives for choosing stability over Iranian-directed violence. Oil revenues reached record levels as Iraq expanded production capacity and secured new export contracts with Asian markets. The economic growth translated into government jobs, infrastructure projects, and improved public services that benefited former militia fighters and their communities. Iraqi nationalism became associated with economic prosperity, while Iranian influence was linked to instability that threatened continued growth. Specific instances throughout 2024 revealed Iraqi militias' willingness to refuse Iranian requests for attacks against American or Israeli targets within Iraq. In March 2024, Revolutionary Guard commanders asked Iraqi militias to target American diplomatic facilities in Baghdad in response to Israeli strikes against Iranian assets in Syria. The militia groups declined, citing orders from Baghdad to avoid provocative actions that could destabilize Iraq's improving international relationships. In August 2024, Iran requested Iraqi militia support for attacks against Israeli commercial interests in the Kurdistan region. Again, the militias refused, prioritizing Iraqi government directives over Iranian operational requests. Improved Iraq-Saudi relations throughout 2024 and 2025 created alternative regional partnerships that reduced Iraqi dependence on Iranian economic and political support. Saudi investments in Iraqi infrastructure projects provided Baghdad with funding sources that didn't require Iranian approval or coordination. The Saudi-Iraqi Business Council facilitated billions of dollars in commercial agreements that gave Iraq economic alternatives to Iranian trade relationships. These partnerships demonstrated that Iraq could prosper without Iranian support while maintaining regional respect and influence. The Iraqi government's anti-corruption campaigns throughout 2024 specifically targeted Iranian-funded militia activities as part of broader efforts to assert state control over all armed groups. Iraqi investigators traced financial flows from Iranian sources to militia organizations, documenting corruption patterns that justified legal action against militia leaders who maintained Iranian connections. Arrest warrants issued against militia commanders who refused integration orders sent clear messages about the costs of continued Iranian loyalty. Iraqi courts charged several prominent militia leaders with corruption, illegal weapons possession, and operating outside state authority. Iraqi Shia identity began separating from Iranian revolutionary ideology as local religious authorities emphasized Iraqi rather than Iranian spiritual leadership. Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani's pronouncements throughout 2024 consistently prioritized Iraqi national interests over Iranian regional objectives. The most respected Shia religious authority in Iraq made clear that Iraqi Shia Muslims owed primary allegiance to Iraq rather than Iran, providing religious justification for militia groups to break from Iranian direction. The transformation of Iraqi Shia militias from Iranian proxies to Iraqi national forces represented a devastating blow to Iranian regional strategy. Iran had lost decisive influence in a country where it had once held overwhelming sway, leaving Tehran without reliable allies in a nation that borders both Iran and key American interests in the region. But Iran's leadership had one final card to play, a strategic asset they believed would restore their regional dominance and force the world to take Iranian power seriously once again. The nuclear program miscalculation. Iran's nuclear program advancement throughout 2024 created the exact opposite effect that Tehran's strategists had anticipated. Instead of providing leverage that would force international concessions and deter military action, Iran's nuclear progress united global opposition in ways that previous Iranian activities had never achieved. The program that was supposed to guarantee Iranian security became the primary catalyst for unprecedented international coordination against Tehran. Every centrifuge that spun faster, every gram of enriched uranium that accumulated, every technical milestone that Iranian scientists achieved only deepened Iran's isolation and strengthened the resolve of nations that had previously maintained neutral positions on Iranian regional activities. The specific nuclear milestones Iran achieved throughout 2024 triggered alarm bells across multiple continents and created the coordinated international response that Iranian leadership had desperately wanted to avoid. Iran's uranium enrichment reached 84% purity by mid-2024, crossing the threshold that made weapons-grade material production a matter of weeks rather than months. The International Atomic Energy Agency documented Iran's accumulation of over 150 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, representing enough material for multiple nuclear weapons if further processed. Iranian facilities began operating advanced IR-6 centrifuges at unprecedented scales, dramatically reducing the time required to produce weapons-grade material from theoretical future capability to immediate present danger. Iran's development of uranium metal production capabilities throughout 2024 eliminated any remaining ambiguity about the program's military intentions. Uranium metal serves no purpose in civilian nuclear programs, but represents an essential component of nuclear weapons construction. IAEA inspectors documented Iranian production of uranium metal in quantities and purities that could only support weapons development rather than power generation or medical isotope production. The technical achievements demonstrated Iranian mastery of the entire nuclear fuel cycle, including the most sensitive processes required for weapons production. European allies that had previously maintained diplomatic engagement with Iran joined American sanctions efforts with unprecedented unity throughout 2024 as Iranian nuclear progress eliminated any remaining European hopes for diplomatic solutions. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom coordinated sanctions packages that specifically targeted Iranian nuclear development infrastructure, scientific personnel, and financial networks supporting the program. The European Union's decision to implement sanctions targeting Iranian nuclear activities represented a fundamental shift in European policy that Iranian planners had assumed would never occur. European sanctions included travel bans on Iranian nuclear scientists, asset freezes affecting Iranian nuclear research institutions, and export restrictions on dual-use technologies that Iranian nuclear facilities required for continued operations. Iran's nuclear progress scared potential regional partners away, rather than attracting them closer, as Tehran had calculated. Arab governments that had been exploring improved relationships with Iran throughout 2023 began distancing themselves as Iranian nuclear capabilities advanced. Saudi Arabia accelerated its own nuclear program discussions with international partners while emphasizing peaceful purposes and full IAEA compliance. The UAE expanded its security cooperation with Israel and Western partners, specifically citing concerns about Iranian nuclear weapons development. Even China and Russia began expressing private concerns about Iranian nuclear activities that complicated their public support for Tehran. Regional nuclear proliferation concerns became central to Arab state calculations throughout 2024 as Iranian capabilities advanced. Gulf governments began discussing their own nuclear options as Iranian nuclear progress continued, creating exactly the regional arms race dynamics that had previously deterred international action against Iranian facilities. Saudi officials made clear that Iranian nuclear weapons capability would trigger Saudi nuclear weapons development, potentially creating a Middle Eastern nuclear cascade that threatened global security. These concerns motivated international pressure on Iran rather than acceptance of Iranian nuclear advancement. Israel's enhanced military capabilities throughout 2024 made Iranian nuclear facilities more vulnerable than they had ever been since the program began. Israeli demonstrations of precision strike capabilities against Iranian assets in Syria and elsewhere convinced Tehran that Israeli threats against Iranian nuclear facilities were credible rather than rhetorical. Advanced Israeli bunker-busting capabilities, enhanced intelligence penetration of Iranian facilities, and improved delivery systems made successful Israeli strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure increasingly likely rather than theoretically possible. Intelligence sharing between Israel and Western partners throughout 2024 exposed Iranian nuclear activities to unprecedented international scrutiny. Detailed intelligence about Iranian nuclear facility operations, personnel movements, and technical achievements reached European and American decision-makers with accuracy that eliminated Iranian ability to conceal sensitive activities. Behind-the-scenes intelligence sharing revealed Iranian nuclear activities that IAEA inspectors had been unable to detect through official monitoring procedures. Western intelligence agencies documented undeclared Iranian nuclear activities at facilities that had not been subject to international inspection. The nuclear program became a liability that isolated Iran rather than an asset that provided protection or leverage in international negotiations. Every technical achievement that Iranian scientists celebrated became another justification for international sanctions, military threats, and diplomatic isolation. The program that was supposed to deter Iranian enemies instead motivated them to coordinate responses that Iran couldn't counter through conventional diplomatic or military means. The massive costs of nuclear program development diverted resources from maintaining proxy relationships that had provided Iran with alternative sources of regional influence and security. Iran spent billions on nuclear development throughout 2024, while cutting proxy support dramatically during the same period. The financial trade-off became clear. Iran chose nuclear development over proxy network maintenance, weakening its regional influence while advancing nuclear capabilities that increased rather than decreased its international isolation. Iranian leadership began recognizing by late 2024 that nuclear advancement had become counterproductive to Iranian security interests rather than essential for Iranian survival. The program that was supposed to represent Iran's ultimate strategic weapon had become its greatest strategic weakness, motivating international cooperation against Iran while providing no meaningful protection against the threats that Iranian nuclear development had created. Iran's nuclear program miscalculation represents the most expensive strategic error in the Islamic Republic's history. What Iran's isolation really means. The scale of this strategic collapse reveals what Iran's isolation actually means for Middle Eastern power dynamics and the Islamic Republic's survival prospects. Iran's strategic position in 2025 represents a complete reversal from its regional peak in 2019 to 2020, when Tehran appeared to dominate Middle Eastern geopolitics through an extensive network of proxy relationships and great power partnerships. The transformation has been so dramatic that intelligence analysts struggle to find historical precedents for such rapid strategic decline by a major regional power. In 2019, Iran's proxy network controlled significant territory across 4 countries, maintained regular coordination through established command structures, and received consistent funding that exceeded $2 billion annually. Iranian influence extended from Gaza's Mediterranean coastline to Yemen's Red Sea ports, creating a strategic arc that threatened Israeli security and constrained American military options throughout the region. The metrics of Iranian decline across every major relationship tell a story of systematic strategic failure that goes far beyond temporary setbacks or tactical miscalculations. Proxy funding has sharply declined due to sanctions and regional strains, representing a massive reduction in the financial foundation of Iranian regional influence. Diplomatic engagement has similarly collapsed, with high-level meetings between Iranian officials and proxy leadership falling from monthly coordination sessions to complete communication blackouts lasting over 6 months. Intelligence sharing arrangements that once provided Iran with real-time regional awareness have been terminated by proxy groups that now view Iranian intelligence requests as security risks rather than mutual cooperation. Great power relationships that provided Iran with international protection and economic alternatives have deteriorated even more dramatically than proxy connections. Russia-Iran trade peaked at $18 billion in 2022, but fell to less than $6 billion by late 2024 as Moscow redirected resources toward its European conflict priorities. China-Iran commercial relationships similarly declined from $85 billion annually to approximately $45 billion, as Beijing calculated that supporting Iran complicated more valuable partnerships with Gulf Arab states. The 8-month gap in substantive diplomatic contact between Iranian leadership and both Russian and Chinese officials represents the longest period of great power isolation that Iran has experienced since the 1979 revolution. Iran's domestic political stability faces unprecedented pressure as the regime struggles to maintain legitimacy without the external successes that had previously justified domestic sacrifices and international isolation. The Iranian economy contracted by 12% throughout 2024, while inflation surged above 40%, creating conditions that historically have triggered major political upheavals in authoritarian systems. Iranian citizens who had accepted economic hardship as the price of regional influence and revolutionary ideology began questioning whether continued confrontation with the international community served Iranian national interests. Protest movements that had been suppressed through appeals to external threats and revolutionary solidarity gained momentum as those external justifications lost credibility. The regime's traditional method of maintaining domestic support through external confrontation and regional influence has become counterproductive as Iranian regional activities now trigger international responses that worsen rather than improve Iranian domestic conditions. Iranian proxy operations that once demonstrated state power and ideological commitment now serve as justifications for enhanced international sanctions that directly harm ordinary Iranian citizens. The nuclear program that was supposed to provide ultimate security guarantees has instead motivated international coordination that threatens regime survival more directly than any external military threat Iran had previously faced. The long-term implications of losing both proxy networks and great power backing simultaneously create strategic vulnerabilities that Iran cannot address through conventional diplomatic or military responses. Iranian regional influence had depended on the combination of proxy capabilities and great power protection that made direct confrontation with Iran prohibitively expensive for regional rivals. Without proxy deterrence or great power backing, Iran faces potential isolation that could culminate in regime change efforts that Tehran would be unable to counter through traditional resistance strategies. Regional powers now make decisions about Middle Eastern security architecture without considering Iranian interests or capabilities in their strategic calculations. Saudi Arabia's normalization discussions with Israel proceed without Iranian input or concern about Iranian retaliation. Gulf Arab states coordinate security arrangements that explicitly exclude Iranian participation while addressing threats that Iranian proxy network once posed. Even traditional Iranian allies like Syria have begun hedging their relationships with Tehran as Iranian support becomes more liability than asset in regional political dynamics. The economic vulnerabilities that Iranian isolation has exposed threaten the material foundations of regime survival in ways that ideological appeals cannot address indefinitely. Iran's inability to access international banking systems, technology markets, and energy partnerships has created economic constraints that limit the regime's ability to provide basic services to Iranian citizens. The brain drain accelerating throughout 2024 and 2025 has removed technical expertise that Iran requires for economic development and military capabilities maintenance. Iranian oil exports, constrained by international sanctions and reduced by regional instability, provide insufficient revenue to fund both domestic requirements and external commitments. Military vulnerabilities have become equally apparent as Iranian conventional forces demonstrate capabilities that lag increasingly behind regional rivals who have enhanced their defense partnerships with advanced military powers. Iranian air defense systems proved inadequate against Israeli precision strikes throughout 2024, revealing technical deficiencies that Iranian domestic production cannot address without international cooperation that remains unavailable. Iranian naval capabilities in the Persian Gulf face coalition opposition that overwhelms Iranian defensive systems while threatening Iranian energy export infrastructure that provides the regime's primary revenue source. Iran's revolutionary ideology has transformed from a regional asset that attracted allies and legitimized resistance activities into a liability that complicates diplomatic engagement and economic partnerships. The ideological framework that once provided Iran with soft power influence across Shia populations and anti-Western movements now serves as justification for international isolation and regional opposition. Iranian appeals to revolutionary solidarity ring hollow when Iranian support consists of ideology rather than material assistance that addresses practical problems facing potential allies. The realization that Iran's decades-long strategy has not just failed but actively backfired represents the most devastating conclusion for Iranian strategic planning since the revolution began. Every major Iranian initiative designed to enhance security and regional influence has produced outcomes that increased rather than decreased Iranian vulnerabilities. The proxy network weakened Iranian security by motivating international coordination against Tehran. The nuclear program accelerated rather than deterred international pressure. Great power partnerships collapsed when Iran most needed external support. Regional influence declined as Iranian activities pushed Arab states toward cooperation with Iranian enemies. This comprehensive strategic collapse creates implications that extend far beyond Iranian borders, potentially reshaping regional power dynamics while raising fundamental questions about whether the Islamic Republic's revolutionary approach can survive in the modern Middle East. The numbers tell the complete story of strategic failure on an unprecedented scale. Iran's isolation in 2025 represents the total collapse of a 45-year regional strategy that began with the 1979 revolution. The proxy network that was supposed to guarantee Iranian security has abandoned Tehran when it needed support most. Great power partnerships that provided international protection have evaporated. The nuclear program that promised ultimate deterrence has instead accelerated Iranian isolation. Every major Iranian strategic initiative has backfired spectacularly, creating the exact opposite outcomes that Tehran intended. Iran's revolutionary model has become fundamentally incompatible with current Middle Eastern dynamics, where economic cooperation trumps ideological confrontation. The question remains whether Iran can survive as a regional power without abandoning the revolutionary framework that defines